Okay, shalom to everyone. I'd like to do Mishnah 4. In a sense, Mishnah 4 and 5 go together, but since Mishnah 5 is a very involved issue about the place of women in 2nd century BCE Judaism, I decided to leave that for next week. And today we'll just talk about Yossi ben Yoezer. In the previous Mishnahs, we had two people who we came across. One was Shimon HaTzadik, who was both a high priest and one of it's called the leftovers, a remnants of the Anshe Knesset Agadola, the men of the Great Assembly. And he had a student, Antigonos Ish Socho, and this Antigonos, who also was a scholar and head of a court. So this Antigonos has a Greek name, as I mentioned before, because when you pass from the Persians to the Greeks, there is this movement away from the biblical period into the period of post-biblical, where wisdom takes over the place of prophecy, as I mentioned in earlier Mishnayot. Now, Antigonos had two students. One was Yossi ben Yoezer Ish Tsereda, and Tsereda is in southern Samaria. And the second one is Yossi ben Yochanan from Jerusalem. Now, it's already been pointed out in other places that these pairs, there are 7 pairs who are mentioned in chapter 1 of Pirkei Avot. And in each case, the first one is always the president of the Sanhedrin, and the second one is always the head of the court of the Sanhedrin, or in Hebrew, Av Beit Din. Another interesting thing is that Yossi ben Yoezer is also a high priest, just like Shimon HaTzadik. In the early days of the court of the Sanhedrin, because remember, before it was the men of the Great Assembly, now it becomes the Sanhedrin. In the early days, you have Kohanim running the Sanhedrin. By the time that the temple falls, the ones who will be the presidents of the Sanhedrin will only be descendants of the house of David. For instance, Yehuda Hanasi, Yehuda, the famous president, who is called Rebbe, the redactor of the Mishnah, the Gamliel family, Shimon ben Gamliel, all of these, there are descendants from King David, because after the temple was destroyed and after the kings of Israel were gone, the only remnant of royalty was, in a sense, the Sanhedrin, which was the judicial system, which was the only one of 3 that remained. Once you didn't have the priesthood and you didn't have the kings, all you had left as an element of power was the Sanhedrin, and therefore it became the custom that the president of the Sanhedrin be a descendant of King David, in order to remind us that one day a descendant of King David has to be the political leader again. So, it says Yossi ben Yoezer, a man of Tsereda, which is the town he's from, and Yossi ben Yochanan Ish Yerushalayim, Kiblu Mimenu. Now there are 2 different versions here. Very often it says Kiblu Mehem. They received from them. Who would them be? Antigonos is only one person. That would mean that they had studied both with Antigonos and with Shimon HaTzadik. However, Rashi and other early versions say Mimenu, from him, meaning they were students only of Antigonos Ish Socho, which would make more sense. Yossi ben Yoezer says, Yehi beitcha beit levad lechachamim. Let your home be a home for sages, a home where sages assemble. V'havei mitavek b'afar ragleihem, and which literally means you should struggle or battle with the dust of their feet, which sounds like struggle with them. However, the way Rashi and others explain it, it's literally, even though mitavek in Hebrew can mean to struggle, which is already a term found in Genesis, but in this case it means actually to sit in the dirt, because in those days floors were dirt floors. They didn't actually have, unless you were very wealthy and had a mosaic floor, most people had a regular dirt floor. So to sit in the dirt in front of them is literally, they're talking, you sit down on the dirt floor and you listen, meaning don't think you're that important that you cannot sit in the dirt in front of the sages to listen to their words. And you shall drink with thirst whatever they are telling you. Now, how does this relate to what we were saying before? It's already been pointed out by a modern commentator on the Mishnah, the Kahati, Pinchas Kahati, that if you remember, Shimon HaTzadik said that the world stands on three things: Al HaTorah, and Torah, on the service of God, whether the temple or prayer, and on acts of kindness. So Kahati points out that these three people, meaning Antigonos, who is the student of Shimon HaTzadik, and Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan, the students of Antigonos, they actually talk about these three things. For instance, Antigonos said, "Do not be like the servant who serves the master for reward, but be like the servant who serves the master without reward," meaning out of love. But he's talking about the service of God. So that's avodah, the service, one of the three things that Shimon HaTzadik spoke about. And the second thing is Yossi ben Yoezer, and he's talking about Torah, because he's talking about that you should make your house a house of assembly of Torah sages, and you should sit in front of them to listen, and you should drink with thirst everything they have to tell you. So Yossi ben Yoezer is talking about Torah. Antigonos was talking about avodah, the divine service. Yossi ben Yoezer is talking about Torah. And Yossi ben Yochanan, or Yosef ben Yochanan, how he's called sometimes, he says, may your home be open, wide open for the poor, and let the poor be those who come to your house. So he's actually talking about acts of kindness. So we have these two Mishnayot, Mishnah Gimel, Mishnah Daled. Either all three of them, according to one version, are students of Shimon HaTzadik, or according to the second version, like Rashi, Antigonos is a student of Shimon HaTzadik, and the other two are his students. But basically, they're now applying what they studied from Shimon HaTzadik. The world rests on three things: Torah, the divine service, and acts of kindness. So Antigonos talked about divine service, Yossi ben Yoezer talks about Torah and Torah scholars, and Yossi ben Yochanan talks about acts of kindness with poor people. So that would show a relationship between this. However, I want to go back for a moment to Antigonos, because there's something I would like to add to what I said last week. Antigonos says that you should not be somebody who serves the master in order to receive reward. Now, I mentioned last week that we have to understand this in light of the argument with the Sadducees who did not believe in the idea of the world to come, the Pharisees who did, and basically the scholar here, Antigonos, is saying, even though we believe in the world to come, that's not the reason why you should devote yourself to the master, meaning to God, not in order to seek reward, do it out of love. But he adds on at the end, but you should still have the fear of heaven upon you. Now, it's interesting, the Tosfot Yom Tov, in his discussion of this Mishnah, so he asks the question, he says, he brings actually a Tosfot, there are two different people. The Tosfot Yom Tov is a commentary, a Yom Tov Liebman Heller. He lived in Krakow and he's buried in Krakow. And this is one of the famous commentaries on the Mishnah. So he brings a Tosfot, one of the Tosfos from the 12th century, who in Avodah Zarah and also in Psachim Davchet, asked the question, if Antigonos says you should not be somebody who is worshiping in order to receive reward, why is it the Talmud itself brings a Braita, brings a saying of the Tanakh sages, and the saying goes like this: if a person says, I am giving this money for charity on condition that I have a place in the world to come, or on condition that my children live a long life, so the Braita says this person is saintly, tzaddik amor. So the Tosfot already asked the question, doesn't this contradict what Antigonus is saying in last week's Mishnah? Because he was saying you should not be a person who worships the master for reward. And this man is giving the charity on condition that he gets a place in the world to come, or that his children live a long time. And this puzzles the Tosafos. And they give two answers, and the first one is very puzzling, the second one makes more sense. The first answer they give is that the Braita, which is talking about doing things for reward, that's talking about non-Jews. But Jews shouldn't do things for reward. So then the Tosfot Yom Tov, the commentary in the Mishnah, says, I don't understand. You're saying there's a Braita written in the Talmud for non-Jews, meaning we weren't supposed to see that? What does that mean? However, the Tosfot itself clarifies what it means in Psachim Chet, in Psachim page 8. Because the Tosfot actually there says that basically it's not, if a person means to do the mitzvah for God's sake, it's not a terrible thing that they also want reward, because human beings are human beings. It's just not the highest level. And I think that's obvious. However, I interpret it a little bit differently. The way I interpret it is like this. This man already gave the money for charity. It's true he made a condition that he live a long time or have a place in the world to come, or that his children live a long time. But in the meantime, the money he gave to have a place in the world to come, he has no idea if he's going to have it. Whether his children will live a long time, he has no idea. So basically, he did an act of faith. The fact that on the side he also wants a reward, but he did the act already. So he did it out of faith. It's not a terrible thing. It's worse if a person doesn't see the value. But retracting from all these questions, the way I explained it last week, I think is the most obvious. That if we understand that Antigonus was basically speaking au contraire to those who don't believe in the world to come. So he's saying, despite the fact that we believe in the world to come, this is not the mindset that you should have. Your mindset should be to worship God out of love, but also to have fear. So today I would like to expand a little bit on the meaning of love and fear in Jewish text, and then I'll go back to Yossi Ben Yoezer, the man of Tzureda. There's a lot of discussion on love and fear. Maimonides, for instance, in general, when he talks about the world to come in his introduction to Chelek, in his commentary on the Mishnah and Sanhedrin, he says basically, even though we believe in the world to come, it's not a good idea to focus on it too much. We should be like servants of Abraham, because Isaiah said about Abraham, Avraham Ohavi, Abraham, my lover, because Abraham did things out of love of God. And this is what a person should strive for. However, as Rabbi Cook writes in his Orot Riyah, not everybody can live their lives on the level of love all the time, because we're not always at our best. And therefore, fear of God helps us when we're not on the level of love of God. So if we're not at our best, at least we will not sin if we have also the fear of God. So even somebody who can reach, even often, the level of love of God, you need the fear of God, because if you're not on that level, to hold you in check and to keep you on the right path. Having said this, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, Ramchal, in 18th century Italy, the famous Kabbalist and writer and philosopher and logic, wrote a book on logic and the Talmud. He actually wrote plays. I mean, he was quite talented, Ramchal. So in his famous ethical work, Mesilat Yesharim, The Path of the Just, he says there are actually three levels. The lower level is called fear of God. The higher level is called love of God. And the higher level above that is also a form of fear, but it's called reverence. It says, you see, fear, if you only have fear of God, that's not going to take you very far, Luzzatto says. Therefore, the higher level is love. But once you have already reached the level of love, the higher level is called reverence. Reverence is not the same thing as fear. It's not that you're scared. Reverence means you are scared to let God down. You are afraid to let God down because you realize how important your connection to God is, and you realize how awesome this. It's not exactly fear, it's understanding the awesomeness of God, not that you're scared. So this is Luzzatto, so it's 3 levels: fear, love, reverence. In his book Musar Avicha, Rabbi Kook, Abraham Isaac Kook, tries to flesh out the first level. He says, even when we say fear, love, reverence, let's talk about the first level. Even under fear, there's a level. See, fear of God, Rabbi Kook writes, is positive. But there's a negative level under that, which is called fear of sin. He says the problem with fear of sin is that you're not fearing God. He says worse than the lower than the level of fear of God is fear of sin, because there's no relationship with God. You're afraid of punishment. You're not afraid of God. And in a sense, equal to fear of punishment is the love for the reward. They're equally bad. That's not love of God. He says the 2 levels you have to try to get over are the fear of sin and the love of reward, or the fear of punishment and the love of reward, because God's not in the picture in neither of them. So Rabbi Kook says those 2 are really negative, and you have to try to get over them, because God is not in the relationship in those 2. But fear of God is a higher level than the fear of sin or the love of reward. Having said that, even on the level of love of God, there's also a parallel of fear. I hope this is not getting too complicated. If I had a whiteboard, I would write it out. Again, the lowest levels are called fear of sin, or the fear of punishment, and the love of reward. The next level above is called the fear of God, meaning there's a relationship. The next level above that is called the love of God. However, in Hasidic writings, it's explained, because especially in the book of Tanya, there are many levels of love and fear. That equal to the love of God is the fear of losing the relationship. You see, there's a difference between the fear of God and the fear of losing the relationship with God. So the partner on the same level of the love of God is the fear of losing a relationship. It's like when 2 partners are greatly in love. They're always afraid to quarrel because they don't want to lose the relationship. Of course, when you quarrel and you wake and you figure things out, it actually strengthens the relationship and makes it more durable. But there's always this little fear not to lose the love. And then again, the higher level we said was reverence. So we've already talked about 4 different levels. A negative level, which is called the fear of sin or the fear of reward, and the fear of punishment and the love of reward. Fear of God, where God is already in the relationship. Love of God, which the equal would be fear of losing the relationship. And finally, the highest level is reverence, which Luzzatto also calls Yorei Boshet, which means being embarrassed not to do my best. So what Antigonos is really talking about is a very important topic within the service of God. There are different types of love and relationship in each level that you attain in the service of God, in your understanding of your relationship between you and God. Now, what about Yossi ben Yoezer again? I'd like to mention something about Yossi ben Yoezer. He was a high priest, like Shimon HaTzadik. And as I said, he's talking about, his idea here is talking about the relationship with Torah. And the way you love God is by loving the scholars of Torah. And since he's talking about Torah, it's bringing Torah into your home. So, as the Maharal of Prague says, that Antigonos is talking about, Shimon HaTzadik talking about the world. Three things the world stood. Antigonos is talking about the individual, levels of love in God and the service of God. And Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan are talking about your house. That's what the Maharal points out. But in your house, you have to make your house a house of scholars. That's what Yossi ben Yoezer says. Actually, an interesting point that the Maharal points out, which is different than what I said in the name of Pinchas Kahati. He claims that each one of these pairs, now of the 7 pairs, the first one is going to say something about the love of God, and the second one will say something about the fear of God. The way he explains it here is also quite innovative. He says it's, when he's talking about scholars, but it says in the Midrash, Sifri says, how can you love God? By loving the scholars of Torah. So the Maharal says Yossi ben Yoezer is talking about the love of God, meaning, however, through the medium of Torah, through the medium of loving the scholars of Torah. And Yossi ben Yochanan, who says, let your house be open for the poor. So the way he explains this is that a person who has a lot of ego feels, why do I have to hang around with these beggars? But a person who is very humble, and humility comes out of the fear of God, will not see the difference between himself and the beggars. These are children of God, and he's children of God. So according to the Maharal, this is an act of reverence, or fear of God. So the Maharal says, Yossi ben Yoezer is talking about the love of God, meaning loving the scholars. And Yossi ben Yochanan is talking about the fear of God, meaning humility. Through reverence of God, you have humility, and we're all created in the likeness of God. So the fact that they don't have money doesn't put them on a different level than myself. Now, I'd like to finish with a story about Yossi ben Yoezer. And this story is actually brought in Midrash Rabbah. It's actually quite a tragic story. It seems that Yossi ben Yoezer lived at the time of the Hasmoneans. It is somewhere around Antiochus IV, who, if you remember, defiled the temple right before the Hanukkah story and made it a pagan temple. And eventually the Hasmoneans were able to reconquer Jerusalem and purify the temple. That's the Hanukkah story. So it turns out that this Yossi ben Yoezer, who was the high priest exactly during this time. And he refused to comply with the Greeks. And the Midrash relates a story about this. The Midrash tells the story about a fellow whose name was Yakum Ish Tzrorot. Yakum, the man of tied bundles. And who is Yakum, the man of tied bundles? He was the nephew of Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer, the man from Tzreda, who we just talked about, who was the high priest and the president of the Sanhedrin. The Midrash continues. The story goes that Yakum Ish Tzrorot was riding his horse on the Sabbath. Obviously, he was a rebellious Jew, nothing like his uncle. Azal kume sharita de mitzdabla. And as he was riding past what we would call a crucifixion. If you remember, under the Greeks and the Romans, they used to tie people to poles, which later on under the Romans was called crucifixion because it was a T-pole. But sometimes it was just one pole. So this was already under the Greeks. Why did they tie up Yossi ben Yoezer, the man that's traded to the pole? Because he refused to cooperate with the Seleucid kings who wanted to defile the temple and make it into pagan worship. So obviously he was rebelling against them, and to show them who was boss, they hung him up on a pole as a death sentence. And his nephew, who was a Hellenist and a rebellious Jew, but worse than a secular Jew. He wasn't just secular, he was rebellious. Secular Jew today is just somebody who doesn't know much about Judaism, but he turned away this Yakum Ish Tzorot. And he was riding on his horse right by his uncle, who was hung up on a pole. And he was slowly dying on that pole. And the nephew said to the uncle, this Yossi ben Yoezer, the man from Streda, says, Chami Susi, look at my horse that I am riding on, which I got from my master, my Hellenistic master. And look at the horse that your master has given you, meaning my master, the king of the Seleucid, gave me a beautiful horse that I'm riding on, but your master, meaning God, put you on this terrible wooden horse that you're dying on. How do you explain that? So Yossi ben Yoezer, who was hung up on the pole, looked at his nephew, and he said to him quietly, if to those who anger God, he gives such rewards, even more so to those who do God's will, that God will give them great rewards in the world to come. Then the nephew said to his uncle, says, Uncle, is there anybody who has done the will of God more than you in your lifetime? And Yossi ben Yoezer looked at him again, half dead on this pole, and he said, if this is the way God is repaying those who do his will in this world, think of how he's going to repay those who anger him in this world. The nephew looked at his uncle and was shocked that a man dying on a pole, hung up by the government, would be able to say such things. And it says it bothered him so much he couldn't stop thinking about it all day. The term used here is almost like snake venom. It was going through his mind. He couldn't get it out of his head. He decided, he said, if this is my uncle, who was such a great saint, and this is the way he talks in his dying moment, maybe he's right. And he decided, I don't want this anymore. I don't want to be a Hellenist. I don't want to work with these people. Let me just die as a Jew. And the Midrash continues and said this Yakum Ish Tzorot, the nephew, decided he would kill himself with all the 4 punishments mentioned in the Torah: stoning, burning, and being hung, and being strangled. I won't go into the gory details, but they actually say how he managed to do all 4 at the same time. And finally, when he was burnt, consumed in the fire, Yossi ben Yoezer, in his last breaths, could see the soul of his nephew rising up to heaven. And in his last breath, he said, my nephew is going to make it to the Garden of Eden even before me. This was Yossi ben Yoezer, the man of Tzoreda. Not only was he a scholar and the high priest, but he gave his life for the Jewish people, and people were inspired by the paradigm of his life. So his nephew, who had gone astray, became a Hellenist, disconnected from his people. In that one meeting with him, to transform his life. And the secret, says Yossi ben Yoezer, is to tie yourself to scholars, to learn from them, from what they say, from their deeds, and this will keep you on the right path for the rest of your life. Next week, we will continue with Mishnah Hay, and the topic will be Yossi ben Yochanan and understanding the place of women in Judaism in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Shalom, shalom.